American soldiers out of Vietnam. Apparently, John Kennedy had determined that this decision would be an unpopular one because he had decided to remove the troops after the election of 1964. He was going to seek re-election in that year, and he must have felt it would not be wise to remove the troops before that date. One of the ways I learned of Kennedy's decision to make that move was by reading this book, and I'll turn it sideways, called The Secret Team. It was written by Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty, President Kennedy's contact between the CIA and the Department of Defense. He wrote this, number 4. Colonel Prouty, Kennedy's advisor, wrote, all of Kennedy's closest advisors knew that he planned to announce a pullout once he had been reelected. Someone else who agreed with this scenario was Senator Wayne Morse of Oregon, one of only 2 U.S. senators who voted against the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that committed the United States to the war in Vietnam. I heard the senator explain that he had talked to the president and heard him say that he was going to pull the troops out of Vietnam. But before he could do that, the president, John Kennedy, went to Dallas, Texas on November the 22nd, 1963, and as you know, he never returned. The troops were not pulled out of Vietnam. And less than a year later, America entered the war because of an event called the Gulf of Tonkin incident. It was claimed that 2 North Vietnamese PT boats fired on an American destroyer, the USS Maddox, which was in international waters off the coast of North Vietnam. There was another alleged attack on another destroyer, the USS Joy. Because of this unprovoked attack, President Lyndon Johnson ordered a massive retaliation against the North Vietnamese, and America was in an undeclared war that would last about 9 years, all because of an attack at the Gulf of Tonkin that did not happen. This is a book called In Love and War, and I'll turn it sideways this way. You can see the title, In Love and War, written by Jim and Sybil Stockdale. Jim Stockdale was the commander. In fact, he was called Commander Jim Stockdale and later became a Vice Admiral Jim Stockdale. And he was the first Air Force pilot over the scene of the alleged attacks in the Gulf of Tonkin. Here's what the commander said about that incident. Number 5. I maneuvered my airplane trying to find whatever boat the destroyers were talking about. I had the best seat in the house from which to detect boats, if there were any. For the life of me, I could not find any. In other words, the Gulf of Tonkin incident did not happen. This conspiracy keeps causing incidents to get us to support their war plans. In World War I, it was the intentional sinking of the Lusitania. We've covered that in the past. In World War II, it was provoking Japan to attack Pearl Harbor, and we've covered that in the past. And in the Vietnamese War, it was the phony Gulf of Tonkin incident. But the problem was compounded by the fact that our government lied about the entire incident even years later. Admiral Stockdale discusses Robert McNamara's testimony before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee 3.5 years after the alleged incident in 1968. Mr. McNamara was Secretary of Defense at the time of the Gulf of Tonkin incident. He says that, Stockdale says that McNamara testified that the event really happened. The Admiral said this, number 6, nobody was shooting at our destroyers or our airplanes. No ships were hit, and I find it difficult to believe that McNamara did not know that. Now notice that the Vietnamese War was planned by our government in 1945, apparently to become full-blown during the 1960s. Along comes President John Kennedy, who decides to stop the war before it happens. John Kennedy is sent to Dallas, Texas, and he does not return. He was trying to ruin the plans made 15 years before. That was not according to the script. So after the trip to Dallas, the conspiracy had to create an incident to get us involved in the war in Vietnam. And then the government lied about it so that we would not discover the truth. So we were now in what was basically a civil war between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. But there was a major problem facing this conspiracy, and they had to solve it. Vietnam was basically an agrarian, meaning a farming economy. So the planners had a real problem on how to equip the two belligerents in the type of the war that they were planning for the 20th century. We've been told for years that Russia supplied North Vietnam with the heavy 20th century war-making technology that they needed to wage the war, and that the United States supplied the South. Number 7, it is known that Russia supplied 80% of North Vietnam's war materials, but it is not known that the United States supplied Russia. Now, this is a cartoon that more correctly illustrates the true situation during the war. In the upper right-hand corner, we see Uncle Sam carrying trade to the Soviet Union, which in turn sends that trade down a pipeline to the Viet Cong, meaning the North Vietnamese. The pipeline is sending arms, grenades, ammunition, medicine, and rations. But since trade is two-way, in other words, we send you something, you've got to send us something, the Viet Cong have to send us something in return. Caskets on American ships returning to the United States. The caskets were not empty. They contained bodies of dead American fighting men. That's only fair, isn't it? We sent the Viet Cong something, and they used it to kill Americans. It's only fair that we take back those that they killed. Now let me try to prove that our trade with Russia actually killed our own fighting men. All commodities sold to Russia through the porous, quote, Iron Curtain, unquote, must be licensed by the Department of Commerce. The Department of Commerce gets its authority to license exports from the President of the United States. The President gets his authority from Congress, which has the authority under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution to regulate commerce with foreign nations. The President from 1969, in the middle of the war until its end, was Richard Milhous Nixon. During the 1968 presidential campaign, candidate Nixon told the American Legion Convention, number 8, Richard Nixon said, as a candidate, there should be no aid or credits of any kind with any country, including the Soviet Union, that aids the enemy in Vietnam. Candidate Nixon admitted that he was aware that Russia was supplying North Vietnam with war-making material for the war, and he was publicly promising the American people that he was not going to tolerate it if he was elected president. This is the November 18, 1968 U.S. News and World Report magazine. The picture at the top shows Mr. Nixon being briefed by President Lyndon Johnson after Nixon was elected. In the lower left-hand corner, is the Nixon quote that I just read. In other words, America knew of the Nixon promise. This is the August 19, 1968 U.S. News and World Report article on the 1968 Republican Party platform. This is the platform that candidate Richard Nixon ran on. These are the promises that the Republican Party made to the American people if we voted them into office. The Republican Party promised us, number 9, nations hostile to this country will receive no assistance from the U.S. We will not provide aid of any kind to countries which aid and abet the war efforts of North Vietnam. In other words, candidate Richard Nixon and the Republican Party he ran on promised us that they would not sell anything to Russia because Russia was selling goods to North Vietnam to kill Americans. That is a reasonable, moral, and rational promise that any moral person could make and then keep. It is not reasonable, moral, or legal to send an American fighting man into a war and then send the enemy the weapons to kill him with. That doesn't make sense. Candidate Richard Nixon became President Nixon in 1968. President Nixon now had the power to keep the promises made by candidate Nixon. As president, he had the power to stop all aid and trade with Communist Russia that was supplying the materials to kill Americans. We can now see if Richard Nixon kept his promises. The Department of Commerce prints, or at least used to print, a quarterly report called the Export Control Bulletin. This report lists the commodities that America sends to Communist Russia each quarter. This is the 97th quarterly report of the third quarter of 1971. It's an old copy, kind of beat up, and I've got it in my own folder. The war, by the way, during the third quarter was still being waged, and this report is very typical of other reports during the war. These are the items that President Richard Nixon allowed American businesses to sell to Russia in just the third quarter of 1971. Number 10, we sent synthetic rubber, lubricating grease and oil, electronic computers, parts and accessories, $170 million worth of foundry and metalworking equipment, parts and accessories, ball and roller bearings. Russian tanks and Russian trucks were being sent to Vietnam to kill Americans, and America was sending Russia ball bearings for those trucks and tanks. We sent them, number 11, oil and gas field production equipment, parts and accessories, airborne navigation equipment and parts, and over $10 million of trucks and parts in just that quarter alone. As I remember, during the last stages of the war in Vietnam, American pilots were risking their lives destroying Russian trucks, bringing goods into North Vietnam along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Apparently, this was reducing Russia's inventories of trucks. So, America sent them new trucks. That makes sense, doesn't it? Russia needs more trucks, so we sent them some. That's perfectly normal, isn't it? The fact that Russia was sending trucks to Vietnam to kill Americans shouldn't deter a business deal between friends, should it? And President Richard Nixon approved the sale, just like he promised he would. Not hardly. But Congress would not be a party to this trade with our enemy, would it? On November the 8th, 1967, during the Vietnamese War, Congressman H.R. Gross tried to amend the Foreign Aid Bill to prohibit American foreign aid grants to nations which were trading with North Vietnam. Congress defeated the amendment 200 to 196. In other words, it's okay if our friendly ally nations which get our foreign aid trade with North Vietnam, which is killing American fighting men. That was the message of that vote. In 1969, the Export Control Act of 1949 came up for renewal. Congressman Earl Landgraf proposed an amendment, number 12. No commodities, military or otherwise, shall be authorized for shipment to any foreign nation which sells or furnishes to North Vietnam any equipment, materials, or commodities, or gives any form of assistance to North Vietnam. In other words, we're not going to sell goods to countries that are helping North Vietnam kill Americans. Now that makes sense, but the amendment was defeated by Congress. What was the message? It's okay if you sell goods to kill Americans. There's one more puzzling story about the Vietnamese War that I'd like to discuss now. The majority of the strategic goods needed by the North Vietnamese to kill Americans came through the port of Haiphong. This is an official U.S. Navy photograph of the Soviet ship Masonry carrying some ZIL trucks to North Vietnam. This is another photograph, this one from the Soviets themselves, showing Russian ships delivering trucks to Haiphong. It is interesting to note what Professor Anthony Sutton has written about Russia's truck manufacturing capability. Number 13. All Soviet truck technology and a large part of Soviet truck manufacturing equipment has come from the West, mainly from the United States. The three letters ZIL stand for the truck factory in Moscow that was built by the A.J. Brandt Company of the United States. In other words, the trucks on the ship were built by American technology. The port of Haiphong, where the ship was headed, was the major deep water port in North Vietnam. But the port had a major problem. The port shown on the upper left-hand corner, or in the upper left-hand corner of this map, is at the mouth of the Red River. That river is a muddy one, and it silts up the harbor. The Vietnamese keep a dredge working 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, scooping out the silt to keep the port open to ocean-going vessels. By the way, that picture you just saw is an actual photograph of that dredge in the Haiphong Harbor. If you want to take the port out of the war, you sink the dredge. And the silt clogs up the harbor, and then Vietnam doesn't get its war materials. If your enemy receives 80% of their war supplies in one port, and that port needs a dredge to keep the silt from clogging up the port, and if you want to win the war, you sink the dredge. And the port silts up, and the enemy can't obtain their supplies, and the war ends. Notice you can win the war without shedding any blood. You just cut off your enemy's supplies. You only need one frogman with some underwater explosives, and he sinks the dredge. And the port silts up, and you win the war. That is, if you want to win the war. If you don't want to win the war, you don't sink the dredge. And then your enemy obtains the supplies they need to kill America's fighting men. And that's exactly what our government did. Nothing. It wasn't as if there was no one concerned about the port of Haiphong. One admiral was very concerned. This is Admiral U.S. Grant Sharp, and he was Commander-in-Chief of the naval operations in the Pacific during most of the Vietnamese War. He said this, number 15, "From the beginning, we should have closed the harbor of Haiphong. This was a great mistake, of course, and immeasurably increased the casualties that our side incurred." But why didn't the admiral just order the sinking of the dredge? He was apparently the highest-ranking officer in the Navy at the time in that area. Apparently he could not order it done, or he would have. So who had the authority to end the war? The President of the United States. But the port of Haiphong, through which as much as 95% of Russia's military aid to North Vietnam was protected by our Air Force. On June the 20th, 1967, number 16, the United States apologized because a Soviet ship was damaged in an American air attack. It was damaged while delivering a cargo to the North Vietnamese port of Cam Pho. Assurances were given that every effort would be made to ensure that such incidents do not occur in the future. In September of 1967, American bombers attacked a communist facility near Haiphong, number 17. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara has given North Vietnamese officials official word that port facilities at Haiphong are safe from attack at present. Which countries had ships in the port unloading war materials to kill Americans? Not only Russia, which you would expect, but other nations as well. These nations, and this is a short list, had ships in Haiphong, number 18, Great Britain, Japan, Greece, Norway, Italy, and West Germany. These nations are supposed to be our allies, but they were hauling goods into North Vietnam to kill Americans. Don't forget, these nations are our allies. Even the United States had ships. Even the United States had ships in the Haiphong harbor unloading goods to kill Americans. Professor Anthony Sutton was able to identify 5 ships being used by Russia on the Haiphong run, carrying goods to kill Americans that still legally belong to the United States. These 5 ships were Liberty ships that were constructed by the hundreds by America for World War II. The Americans loaned, and notice that I said loaned, Russia 121 cargo vessels in 1942 through our Lend-Lease program. These ships were supposed to be returned, and they never were. And 25 years later, our ships, still legally belonging to the United States, were being used to haul goods into Vietnam to kill Americans. But I want to give you one example of how this aid and trade truly backfired on the American government and materially harmed the American fighting man in Vietnam. This is Peter Stark, a Green Beret soldier that served in Vietnam. I had the distinct pleasure and privilege of meeting this fine young man a few years ago and was truly impressed. He was what made this nation great, a fine, patriotic American citizen. Sergeant Stark, the Green Beret, told us, number 19, in 1966, The United States sent the Soviet Union the entire technical specifications which they needed to build a glycerol plant. Glycerol is used in the manufacture of explosives. Specifically in Vietnam, glycerol is used as a detonator of booby traps. As I understand it, a booby trap, as the sergeant called it, is a two-part landmine. The bottom part is TNT and the top part is glycerol. The glycerol explodes into the TNT when it's stepped on, and together they explode up and kill or cripple the soldier. In fact, the booby trap was extremely effective in Vietnam. Sergeant Stark tells us, number 20, over 50% of all American casualties suffered in Vietnam have come from booby traps. Let me try to explain that. 50% of all American casualties stepped on a booby trap. The booby trap came from Russia. A part of the booby trap, the glycerol, came from a factory sent to Russia as, quote, peaceful trade, unquote, by the United States. Now ask yourself this question. Was it the North Vietnamese who killed those Americans who stepped on those booby traps? Was it the Russians who supplied the booby trap? Or was it the American government who sent Russia the factory that made glycerol? I think you would have to agree with me, and do so honestly, that it was the American government. The one thing I didn't tell you about Sergeant Stark is that he stepped on a booby trap, but he was lucky he wasn't killed, but he did lose his legs. That picture is taken of Sergeant Stark while he's seated in a wheelchair. If you believe we should sell to Russia, what would you say to Sergeant Stark? How could you justify the sale of the glycerol plant to Russia when you knew that Russia was supplying arms to kill Americans in a war? How could you face Sergeant Stark and say you saw nothing wrong in that sale to Russia? Our Congress has to answer that question. But not only were America's ground forces betrayed by their government, so were their members in the air forces. America constructed the most bizarre rules of engagement for its Air Force. These rules of engagement were declassified in 1985 and are available to anyone who wants to read them. They tell us, number 21, surface-to-air missiles sites could not be bombed while they were under construction, but only after they became operational. Pilots were not permitted to attack a communist MiG-15, or communist MiG rather, sitting on the runway. The only time it could be attacked was after it was in the air and had shown hostile intentions. Its base could not be bombed. Military truck depots located just over 200 yards from a road could not be destroyed. Enemy trucks on a road could be attacked, but if they drove off the road, they were safe from bombing. In March of 1972, Air Force General John Lavelle tried to protect his forces by ordering, on his own authority, airstrikes against North Vietnamese airfields and missile sites. Was he hailed as an a great American hero? No. He was relieved of his command and for violating the rules of engagement. Because of these strange rules, America lost more planes and pilots than we should have. And that is why America has so many prisoners of war, mostly pilots. Our government did all it could to make sure that our pilots would be shot down. Others have commented on this madness as well. Rear Admiral James Stockdale, the pilot who wrote about the Gulf of Tonkin fraud, wrote this about this government's strange rules, number 22. All targets were selected in Washington on the basis of a naive idea that delicate peacemaking signals could be transmitted by military action. My pilots saw it as taking very expensive and highly capable airplanes right by the power plant to bomb the privy, meaning an outhouse. We found ourselves foolishly risking airplanes and pilots' lives on meaningless targets. General Curtis LeMay, a former Air Force Chief of Staff and commander of the Strategic Air Command during part of the Vietnamese War, found it difficult to sit in meetings he had with President John Kennedy and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. 23, he said. General LeMay said, to sit there in those meetings, seeing our people being killed because of the stupidity of the war plan and not have them pay any attention to my plans to win. General LeMay went on to say this, number 24. In Vietnam, we violated every principle of war that's been proved sound over the centuries because Robert McNamara was afraid the Russians would get mad. General LeMay said this, number 25. It is a war in which we are attempting to win without winning, trying to destroy without destroying. Senator Barry Goldwater said this about the war, number 26. In Vietnam, we fought a 12-year war which could have been ended in 12 weeks. Our political masters were afraid to acknowledge defeat and wouldn't let our military win a victory. Finally, on May the 8th, 1972, Richard Nixon, as president, addressed the nation, number 27. There is only one way to stop the killing, and that is to keep the weapons of war out of Vietnam. I have ordered the following. All entrances to North Vietnamese ports will be mined. Countries with ships presently in North Vietnamese ports have been notified that ships will have to leave. Why did it take Richard Nixon and Lyndon Johnson 12 years to figure it out and win the war by cutting off the supplies of the enemy? Perhaps a good answer to that question came from Admiral Elmo Zumwalt Jr., the Navy representative on the Joint Chiefs of Staff in 1973. In his book entitled On Watch, the Admiral writes about a meeting that he had with Henry Kissinger, the Secretary of State. The Admiral quoted his notes from that meeting, number 28. Kissinger does not agree with the President that the American people can be turned around. Kissinger feels that the U.S. has passed its historic high point, like so many earlier civilizations. He believes that the U.S. is on a downhill and cannot be roused by political challenge. He states that his job is to persuade the Russians to give us the best deal we can get, recognizing that the historical forces favor them. He says that he realizes that in light of history, he will be recognized as one of those who negotiated terms favorable to the Soviets, but that the American people only have themselves to blame because they lack stamina to stay the course against the Russians. I took him on strongly on this, saying that I couldn't accept that the decision to grant the Soviets superior capability in either strategic or conventional fields should be made without putting the issue to the people. In other words, the United States has lost the battle with the Soviet Union, according to Henry Kissinger. And since they are militarily superior, we dare not provoke them into a showdown. So, if we want to oppose regional communism, we can do so, as long as we don't anger the Soviets to retaliate against us. So that means that in the war in Vietnam, try to win the war, but do not offend the Russians. Do not sink their ships in Haiphong. Do not blow up their planes, missiles, or trucks. Do not stop our aid and trade with them, even though it is killing Americans, because that would anger the Russians. And if they attacked us, we dumb Americans wouldn't have the stamina to resist and win. So it's better to not win the war. Just fight it without getting the superior Russians angry. And that's the way we did fight it. Kissinger was right. What was the cost of all of this madness? Number 29, 47,321 American fighting men were dead, 10,700 other casualties, and 153,303 were wounded. But let me return to the general subject of aid and trade with Russia. In 1969, the government's Export-Import Bank and the Chase Manhattan Bank loaned the Russians millions of dollars at an average annual interest rate of 6.5%, with the first payment not due for 10 years, to build the world's largest truck factory. It was built on the Kama River. It would become the largest producer of 10-ton trucks in the world, 100,000 per year, more than all U.S. manufacturers put together. In 1980, a report from the Commerce Department indicated that trucks produced at this factory have been seen with Soviet forces in Afghanistan. Also, some of the trucks were now assigned to Warsaw Pact nations with the communist armies from those nations. So here was another example of how our, quote, peaceful trade, unquote, was used to kill people. But there's an interesting sidelight to the use of the Kama River trucks in Afghanistan. This is a photograph of the road that the Russian army took to reach Afghanistan. It was built by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in 1966. The road was 300 miles of double-lane, all-weather highway that our engineers made certain connected with the one that the Soviets were building in Russia. Some observers have speculated that without the convenience of the new highway, the Soviets might not have launched the invasion and Afghanistan might have been spared their agony. Just how important is this aid and trade between the United States and Russia? Let me summarize the whole subject with this quote from Senator William Armstrong from Colorado. Here's what he said, number 30. In the last 10 years alone, 1972 to 1982, the United States and other Western nations have sold to the Soviet Union and its satellites more than $50 billion worth of sophisticated technical equipment the communists could not produce themselves. This equipment has been used to produce nuclear missiles, military command and control systems, spy satellites, and air defense radars. Now that the United States has built the Soviet Union, a military power of the first order, their attention shifted to the other communist giant, Red China. In 1974, David Rockefeller formed the National Council for U.S. Red China Trade. 5 years later, in 1979, the United States signed a complex trade agreement with Red China. This article said that the agreement would open the way for China to receive U.S. Export-Import Bank credits. What are the Chinese interested? Why are the Chinese interested in American trade? In 1980, Huang Hua, I guess the best I can pronounce it, Foreign Minister of Red China, answered that question, number 31. We are discussing trade with the U.S. with the view of expanding it and opening the door wider to take full advantage of the opportunities it presents to build socialism at home and abroad. In October of 1983, Caspar Weinberger, Secretary of Defense, said this, number 32. Our talks with the Chinese officials could mature very quickly into actual transfers of weapon systems if that is what the Chinese want. He said that the Chinese communists were interested in anti-aircraft weapons, systems, air defense, and anti-tank weapons. In 1983, Mr. Weinberger initiated a military program that resulted in number 33, improving the Chinese F-8 high-altitude jet fighter by the sale of $550 million worth of electronics and radar systems, and providing American technology to produce large-caliber artillery shells more cheaply than in the past, by making available to the Red Chinese Navy an upgraded torpedo to improve Chinese anti-submarine capability. In January the 15th, 1985, the Los Angeles Times reported number 34. The United States and China have agreed on the sale of American naval weapons. The reported agreement on the sale of the remote-controlled phalanx, deck gun, gas turbine engine, sonar equipment, and torpedoes was reached during a recent visit of a Chinese delegation. Now, how does Red China pay for this aid and trade? There are two major ways. The first is number 35, through loans from the U.S. Export-Import Bank. For instance, the first loan from the bank was for $56.2 million at 8.75% interest. The second way is through the purchase of Chinese goods. For instance, in June of 1981, my local newspaper carried this picture of a product that we could buy from China, a flower vase with a built-in radio. One can only wonder, and one can only commend the Chinese for coming up with this marvelous invention before the Americans did. But this poses the next logical question. What does China produce that we could buy to give them American dollars so that they can buy American technology? The Chinese do have one product that we can buy that would transfer American dollars to China, and that is simply hard drugs. It is not commonly known that Red China produces as much as 80% of the world's illegal opiates, primarily opium and heroin. Heroin is the most addictive and most available of the hard drugs. It is made from opium. Senator Barry Goldwater explained to the American people in 1977, number 36, Red China is the major source of the world's hard drugs. Reports indicate that at a minimum, Communist China's annual income from drug smuggling is $500 million annually. The Chinese communists have actually established a marketing company to sell their opium products. It is called Number 37, the Special Domestic Product Trade Company, and it has branches in 30 Chinese cities. Others know about this drug production as well. According to the United Nations Narcotics Commission, Number 38, more than 5 million acres of land in starving China are now devoted exclusively to cultivation of narcotics poppies. This is a map of China showing the drug producing areas in yellow. The lines show how the drugs are moved to 4 ports for export to America. As you can see, large areas of China are under cultivation. The Chinese people know about this drug cultivation. On May the 17th, 1972, a Chinese citizen who escaped from China in 1971, Miss Yuan Moon Ra, testified before a committee of Congress. And we'll pick our program up next week with her testimony that helps us understand why Red China is selling drugs to America and buying American technology. I invite you to tune us in again next week as we continue to explore the secrets of history. Thank you so very, very much.
Welcome to Secrets of History, a series of lectures exploring the conspiratorial view of history. It is the contention of historian Ralph Epperson that wars, revolutions, and depressions are planned years in advance, and that those who have been involved in the planning of these events have been ensuring that their involvement has been removed from recorded history. It will be Ralph Epperson's purpose to discuss the major events of the past and to remove the veil that has been utilized to cover up the secrets of history.
Welcome to Secrets of History. My name is Ralph Epperson, and I am the host of this series. Secrets of History is a 24-week lecture, and I'll explain that in a minute, a 24-week lecture series which will explore the conspiratorial view of history. I have been studying the historical view that holds that the major events of the past have been caused intentionally. About 2 years ago, I wrote and then published my book entitled The Unseen Hand. I've subtitled it An Introduction to the Conspiratorial View of History. Tonight's session is number 24 in the series, and I'd like to explain that because this is not the last in the series. When I first started this series about a year ago, I had anticipated that I could complete it in 24 weeks. I've not been able to do that. I anticipate in week number 24 there'll probably be about another 4 more sessions. So really this is going to be hopefully a 28-week series. But anyway, this is session number 24. Last week we were discussing the fact that I believe that China, Red China, is producing the world's 80% of the world's hard drugs. And the reason they are doing that is to import American dollars so that when America sells Red China, the technology that it's currently selling them, they'll have something to buy it with, American dollars. I believe that's the reason that we fought the major war in Vietnam, was to create a drug culture so that we would have something to buy from Red China so that they could buy American technology. I was talking last week about a young lady by the name of Miss Yuan Moon Ru, and that's the best I can pronounce it, and she testified on May the 17th, 1972, before a committee of Congress. And she told the congressman that she had personally witnessed Red Chinese soldiers harvesting opium crops in Yunnan province. She testified this way: I saw with my own eyes the Chinese Communist Army growing opium in that area. And our government used to know that she was telling the truth. That is up until about 1961, when suddenly knowledge about China's drug problem in America disappeared. In 1961, Henry Anslinger was head of the U.S. Bureau of Narcotics. He said this, number 39. The Chinese mainland, under the occupation of a communist regime, is directly responsible for the supply of the illicit narcotics traffic throughout the world. He further testified before the United States Senate, number 40, there is very definite proof that heroin smuggled in from communist China is responsible for a rise in narcotics addiction among juveniles in the United States. But 1961 was the last year that Henry Anslinger was head of the U.S. Bureau of Narcotics. Number 41, when the Kennedy-Johnson appointee, Henry L. Giordano, took over, unkind references to Red China suddenly began to disappear from Bureau of Narcotics publications. The blackout continued up until 1972, when Richard Nixon was president. The official Nixon administration position was at number 42. There is no hard evidence that the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist government, is involved in the covert drug traffic from the Asian mainland. On July the 7th, 1972, nationally syndicated columnist John Chamberlain called the efforts to protect the Red Chinese drug trade the biggest cover-up since World War II. That's a very amazing and interesting comment. But the right hand of Nixon's government did not know what the left hand was saying. The Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs knew that China was producing opium for the world, at least they knew in 1970. They issued an internal memorandum that states, number 43, in the Far East, opium is cultivated in vast quantities in Yunnan province of China. And they should have known for years, because people were telling our government that China's drug production was as old as the Communist Revolution. Congressman Francis E. Walter, former chairman of the House Committee on Un-American Activities, declared as early as 1961, number 44. It was Chairman Mao Tse-tung himself. By the way, Mao Tse-tung was the communist revolutionary who created the Communist government of China in 1949. Chairman Mao himself, who conceived the policy of narcotics peddling. Mao used the profits from its sale to finance its revolution. Today, Red China's armed forces provide guards for opium shipments. How much is all of this drug cultivation worth? Nationally syndicated columnist Paul Scott commented on June the 10th, 1971, that illicit drug production in Red China was worth not millions of dollars, but billions, with a B, billions of dollars. And some have even said what the trade was for. Congressman John Schmitz from California became aware of this aid and trade and wrote an article in 1972 in which he said, number 45, sale of narcotics is the only way Mao can get the dollars to keep his end of the trade bargains he made with President Richard Nixon. Some have figured it out. But America was not a market for drugs until a particular time in our history, until the Vietnamese War of 1964 to 1973. Number 46, I believe that the major purpose of the Vietnamese War was to create a drug culture in America so that the Red Chinese could collect American dollars for the sale of their drugs and buy American technology. Let me summarize why I believe that way. Number 47. The war was planned by Americans in 1945. Our government hired Ho Chi Minh in 1945. Number 3, we supplied him with the necessary supplies and arms to start the revolution. We intentionally did not come to the aid of the French government in the French Indo-Chinese War. Number 5, we fabricated an incident, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, to get American fighting men involved. Number 6, this conspiracy created the anti-war protesters to keep America involved for 10 years. Number 7, the American government, had no intention of allowing our fighting men to win the war. Number 8, that frustration led our fighting men to drugs, which were both plentiful and inexpensive. Number 9, our government picked Vietnam for the war because drugs were plentiful and inexpensive in that country. Number 10, after the war was over, our government did not welcome the Vietnam hero back as a hero. Number 11, that frustration further compounded the veterans' confusion, and many turned to drugs if they weren't already hooked. In 1971, the Bureau of Narcotics identified 68,000 heroin addicts, but experts say that there are 3 or 4 more that aren't known. That means there might be 200,000 to 300,000 heroin addicts. Others Others have made estimates, and they go as high as 500,000 or more. In 1971, our troops in Vietnam were purchasing 95% pure heroin at $10 a fix. When they got back to the United States, the heroin they needed was $200 a day, and the addict was receiving only heroin about 40% pure. With an estimated 600,000 heroin addicts in the 1980s stealing $200 a day, the total property loss would be $120 million a day. That's about $40 billion a year in property theft, and that's an estimate made in 1971. I don't know what that estimate would be for 1988. Excuse me. Others knew about the fact that Red China wanted a war in Vietnam so that Americans would become addicted to heroin or hard drugs. Mohammed Hakel, or Hakel, something like that, a respected Egyptian publisher and longtime confidant of the late President Nasser of Egypt, wrote a book entitled The Cairo Documents. In that book, he comments that Chow En-lai of Red China told Nasser that he wanted the U.S. to escalate the war in Vietnam. Chow said, number 48, "The more troops the U.S. sends to Vietnam, the happier we shall be. Some of the American soldiers are trying opium, and we are helping them. We are planning the best kinds of opium, especially for Americans." But the American media did not tell us the truth about the purpose of the war in Vietnam. Only a few understand. On May the 14th, 1969, one who had figured it out spoke out about the subject. Ed Reed, a Pulitzer Prize-winning author and crime researcher, said this, number 49, "There is no question but that the youth of this country are the victims of a conspiracy. The object is to get the kids on drugs and effectively destroy the next generation of adults." I'd like to now summarize all that we've discussed on this subject of America's aid and trade to the Soviet Union. I'd like to recall the statement made by Anthony Sutton, the researcher who has written about 6 books on this subject. Mr. Sutton wrote this, number 50, "There is no such thing as Soviet technology. Almost all, perhaps 90 to 95%, came from the United States and its allies. In effect, the United States and the NATO countries have built the Soviet Union, its industrial and military capabilities. Almost all of this aid and trade has been approved by the United States government. Every once in a while, an American citizen sells Russia some military secrets, and he is punished by the American government. Something is wrong. Here's one example. In 1986, an American citizen named Jerry Whitworth was caught delivering secrets to the Soviet Union. He was sentenced to 365 years. Why is it right for the United States to sell American technology to Russia and wrong for an American citizen to do the same thing? Here's another example. In 1984, another American, James Harper, pleaded guilty to selling missile secrets to the Soviet Union. The judge who sentenced Mr. Harper called him a traitor and recommended that he never be paroled for his crime. Number 51. The word traitor is defined as one who is guilty of treason. In 1986, President Ronald Reagan considered these sales or transfers of technology so terrible, so wrong, that he signed an executive order that would allow the death penalty for military personnel convicted of espionage during peacetime. In other words, don't sell or give Russia any secrets or technology unless you get the permission of the United States government. Then it's okay. Let me tell you why the sale or transfer of technology is wrong, whether that transfer is approved by the American government or not. This is a very brief, in fact, this is the entirety of the Constitution of the United States. And it clearly tells us why selling or giving technology to the Soviet Union is wrong. You will recall that the judge who sentenced Mr. Harper called him a traitor, and that a traitor was defined as one who is guilty of treason. We can look to the Constitution to define that word treason. That definition is found in Article 3, Section 3 of the Constitution, and it reads, number 52, "Treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them, or, and notice that the word or divides the definition into two parts, or, and this is the second part, or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. Notice that our Constitution says that there are two ways that you can commit treason against the United States. You can levy war against them, or you can give their enemy, our enemy, aid and comfort. Remember that when the judge sentenced Mr. Harper, he said he was guilty of treason. In other words, he was giving aid and comfort to the enemy. The judge identified Russia as our enemy. If Russia is our enemy, then giving them any aid and comfort is treason. Notice, I didn't say that. Our Constitution says that. The judge charged Mr. Harper, number 53. It is difficult how a native-born American can commit such a crime. You are a traitor to your country. There can be no crime more serious than selling our defense secrets. It goes to the very heart and existence of our freedom. Giving aid and comfort to Russia is morally wrong. Giving aid and comfort to Russia is called treason. I didn't say that. Our Constitution said it. It is just as wrong for the government to do it as it is for an American citizen to do it. But unfortunately, not everyone agrees. In 1977, I wrote to my congressman, Morris Udall. You might remember Congressman Udall. He ran against Jimmy Carter in the Democratic presidential primaries in 1976. He was not successful, so he returned to Congress. I told Congressman Udall in my letter that I was aware that our government had been sending technology to Russia for over 60 years, and that I considered it to be wrong. I told him that I was aware that during the Vietnamese War, we were sending goods to Russia, and they were supplying 80% of the war supplies to North Vietnam. I then ended with this sentence, number 54. I am certain that you will agree with me that such trade with communism is immoral and that it should not be allowed to continue. Congressman Udall wrote back on June the 20th, 1977. This is in part what he said. Number 55. Thank you for your recent letter concerning America's military aid to the Soviet Union. As you probably know, this has always been the case since the United States leads the way in such technology. However, I'm not sure this is bad. Now Congressman Udall is going to try to explain why we should sell technology to Russia. He went on, quote, the more the Soviet Union adapts to Western technology, the more their society opens up, and thus the more susceptible to change they become. I'm sure you would agree that sharing our other technology is and will continue to be beneficial to all concerned. That letter was written in 1977. Since then, has communism, quote, opened up, unquote? I do not think so. They've got troops in foreign countries all over the globe leading bloody revolutions. They recently had troops in Afghanistan killing people. They still have 3,000 concentration camps all over Russia, imprisoning over 6 million people, many for political crimes, and most because they want to worship a god in the evil empire, where it's against the law to worship any god. Let me give you another example of Congressman Udall's support of America's trade with communist Russia. After a luncheon meeting a few years ago, I stopped the congressman in the hall and asked him why it was wrong for an American citizen to sell military secrets to Russia. He told me that he considered that act to be reprehensible and certainly punishable by the most severe of punishments. I then asked him why he approved of the sale of American secrets to Russia by American corporations. He answered me by saying that he favored trade with Russia by American corporations because it created jobs. That's his answer. That was precisely what he said. Selling technology is acceptable as long as it creates jobs. But Congressman Udall is only expressing the philosophy of the United States. Our government is actually encouraging businessmen to sell their technology to communist Russia. Once again, we're going to hold this pamphlet up, published by the Department of State in I think it was 1966. I'll get the plastic off so you can see it. There it is. It's called Private Boycotts versus the National Interest. It asks and then answers this question. We've looked at this before. Let's go to number 56. Is it illegal or unpatriotic to sell peaceful goods to communist countries? The State Department was concerned that number 57, a small but active minority apparently believes it unpatriotic to trade in any products from any communist country. And then the State Department answers the question as to whether it is right to sell Russia. They tell us, number 58. The government of the United States believes those who are opposed to this trade are harming the United States national interest by obstructing a foreign policy that has been developed by 4 administrations since World War II. But the State Department is wrong. Selling technology to Russia is wrong. I'd like to prove it by using the last word on the subject, the Constitution of the United States. As we've already seen, it speaks directly to the subject. I'd like to repeat it so you can verify this yourself, to make sure you understand what I'm saying, to make it abundantly clear. Number 59. Treason, according to Article 3, Section 3 of the Constitution, against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. Notice, as I said before, there are 2 ways you can commit treason. Number 60, you can levy war against the United States or, and notice the word or, giving aid and comfort to your enemy. Notice that the word or separates the 2 conditions. That means that treason means one or the other. That definition of treason can read, number 61, treason shall consist in giving aid and comfort to our enemies. Number 62, an enemy is defined by Webster's as a nation hostile to another. The word hostile is defined as unfriendly or having ill will. That means that you do not have to be at war with the United States. A hostile nation is an enemy. Russia has been hostile to the United States for at least 40 years. Russia is America's enemy. That's why American soldiers who sell military secrets to Russia are punished. Giving aid and comfort to Russia is called treason. That means that the American corporation that sells American secrets to Russia should be punished, just like the American soldier. Treason is wrong, and it is time to stop giving aid and comfort to our enemy. And the Russians know that our government has been selling strategic goods to their homeland. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the Russian writer who defected to America several years ago, has written this, number 63. Our whole slave system depends on your economic assistance. When they bury us alive, do not send them shovels and the most up-to-date earth-moving equipment. Why must you hand to communist totalitarianism more and more technology which it needs for armaments and for crushing its own citizens? Yet America disregards the pleas of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and we continue to send technology to Russia. It has been America's consistent policy for over 70 years, and it doesn't matter who is elected as President of the United States, whether he's a Republican or a Democrat, because both Democrats and Republicans have been supporters of the sale of this technology to Russia. And without this aid and comfort, Soviet communism would not exist. We have created our own enemy. Now, I'd like to change the whole direction of this series, at least for this night, and begin a discussion of the scientific world and how the conspiracy that I've discussed for the past 23 weeks has invaded this area of thought. If I am right that this conspiracy does exist, it would be inconceivable that they would not want to enter this lucrative field of knowledge, as they have in every other field of human endeavor. And after studying the field of science, it is my considered opinion that they have indeed been active here as well. I would like to spend the next few hours examining the whole subject of science, primarily the field of origins. How did the universe originate? How did man appear on earth? Why are these diverse forms of life, animal life, and how did they get here? I would like to specifically reiterate the statement I made at the beginning of this series. I would like to ask each of you to open up your minds and examine the evidence as I present it. I believe that this might be the first time you have ever examined the two competing theories of origins side by side. There is a real problem going on in the entire field of science. The scientific world, which was originally committed to the creationist view of origins and later switched to the evolutionist view, is currently switching back to the creationist view. There are only two theories about the origin of life on the earth, and I have chosen to call these two competing theories the oozers and the zappers. I'd like to go to the blackboard and briefly explain the two theories. So please let me try to explain the two basic competing theories of the origins of life. I'd like to start by explaining that no one was present at the time of the beginning of life on earth. Man has to look at the evidence and then try to decide for himself how the process started. It is not possible to prove either theory because neither is taking place now and neither can be reproduced in the laboratory. So we're going to try to examine both theories. The first theory is called the evolutionary theory of origins, and I have chosen to call those who believe in this theory the oozers. And let me try to explain what this theory holds. The oozers believe that out of the primordial ooze at the very beginning of life, chemicals in some combination got together, and out of that started life. That life was very simple in its nature, and through evolutionary change, it has been leading through progressive increases in ability, or complexity to man. This has gone through various forms of animal life, etc., till about 1 million years ago, they say that man appeared on the scene. Man came from this primordial ooze back in the beginning of time. They do not go beyond this period because they do not know where this came from. And you cannot find in any of the readings that I've ever done of the evolutionists what caused this whole process to start. They have no first cause. This whole process, in their mind, took about 4.5 billion years. That's called the theory of evolution. The dinosaurs appeared about 62.5 million years ago. They disappeared. So they got into the process maybe here and lived on the earth for a period of time, and then it became extinct about 62.5 million years ago. As I said, man appeared on the scene about 1 million years ago. I want you to remember this. There's about 61.5 million years where there were neither dinosaurs nor man on the face of the earth. The entire process, as I said, took about 4.5 billion years. The competing theory to evolution is called the creationist view of origins, and I call those who believe in this the zappers. Let me try to explain how this process worked. The reason I call them the zappers is because they believe that at the moment of creation, all life appeared at precisely the same time. There has been no evolution from simple life to complex life, taking billions of years. These people believe that this process did not take place in more than 10,000 years. They believe that man and dinosaurs were here at the same time. They believe that man and the trilobites, which is one of the earliest forms of animal life, were here at the same time. I'm going to try to prove this theory is superior to this. And I want to use this. I want you to understand this. I'm not going to use religion or the Bible. I'm going to use scientific evidence to prove that evolution could not have occurred. This whole process took about 10,000 years. There's the difference. Let's start now by examining the evolutionary view first. Evolution is number one, the concept that species change through time. Over millions of years, small changes accumulate to become large differences. New species arise, others die out. Rates of change vary greatly, and directions of change are unpredictable. Dr. Isaac Asimov, a biochemist at the Boston U School of Medicine, said this, number two, the unit of life, the cell, has developed from precellular scraps of life, and that these in turn have arisen from non-living. These living things have arisen from non-living materials by changes that are in accord with the laws of nature over a vast stretch of several billions of years. Now, evolution has some real problems, and the theory is being challenged by those who hold the creationist view of origins. Evolution teaches that life in the beginning was simple, and that through time it evolved upward into more complex forms of life. Number 3, the real law of change, however, is one of decay, not of growth, a change down instead of a change up. Thus, the laws of thermodynamics, and we'll explain those laws in a few minutes. Thus, the laws of thermodynamics sharply conflict with the philosophy of evolution. Notice what I just said. Laws of science conflict with the theory of evolution. Science does not prove evolution. The laws of science disprove evolution. Let me prove that statement by examining the two laws of thermodynamics. Thermodynamics, number 4, is the branch of physics dealing with the transformation of heat into other forms of energy. Simply stated, thermodynamics is the study of heat transfer. The first law of thermodynamics is called number 5, the law of energy conservation. It states that nothing is now being created or destroyed. Energy cannot create itself, and it is not being created anywhere in the universe. It is only changing its form. The second law of thermodynamics is called number 6, the law of energy decay. I want to point out here, notice they call these laws. A law is something that will occur in every instance. There are no exceptions. These are scientific laws. The second law of thermodynamics is called the law of energy decay. It states that every system left to its own devices always tends to move from order to disorder. That means that every time energy is changed, according to the first law of thermodynamics, it moves towards a lower availability, which makes it less able to be changed again. Professor John Ross of Harvard University recently wrote number 7, there are no known violations of the second law of thermodynamics. The concept of evolution teaches that there is a universal tendency for things to become better organized, more complex, more highly specialized, and adapted. Thus, the concept of evolution is in total opposition to one of the most reliable laws of science. In other words, the universe is decaying, and someday it will completely decay and will reach a point of heat equilibrium. Everything will be the same temperature. I like to use the analogy of a bathtub of cold water. The water represents the universe. If you drop red-hot ball bearings into the water, each representing a star or a sun, in time they will cool off and will be just as cool as the water. There will be heat equilibrium. The first law of thermodynamics says that the ball bearings representing the sun and the stars cannot get hot again because energy cannot be created. The universe will one day run down, and nothing in science says it can get started again. The evolutionists believe that the original building block in creating the universe was the chemical element called hydrogen. One evolutionist, Professor Harlow Shapley, said, number 8, in the beginning, hydrogen, period. A creationist said, number 9, in this view, hydrogen is an odorless, tasteless, invisible gas, which, if given enough time, becomes people. The evolutionists believe that nothing gave rise to existence. Chemicals gave rise to animate life. Let me show you why that theory just won't work. I found these two objects side by side in my garden. They both looked like seeds, but I quickly discovered that one was a rock and the other was a real live seed. I planted them, and one became a magnificent plant, and the other stayed a rock. Even if I could have waited for 5 billion years for that rock to sprout any form of life, it would still remain a rock. Even if I watered it daily, or bombarded it with radiation, or flooded it with sunlight, it would still be a rock when I dug it up later. The evolutionists cannot explain the first cause of life. It is not possible to explain the first cause, something that has the power to turn a rock into a seed, without a designer. And that's where the evolutionists run into problems. The evolutionists want us to believe that there was no designer, even though all of the universe cries out that it had to be designed. Evidence of a design demands a designer. There is no other explanation that fits the facts of the universe. The other theory, as I explained, is called, number 10, the creationist view of origins. I call those, as I said, who hold this view the zappers. This theory holds that, number 11, all basic animal and plant types were brought into existence by the act of a creator, a designer, using special processes which are not operative today. The evolution theory attempts to explain the origin of all things in terms of natural laws and processes which operate today as they have in the past. Number 12, evolution, after all, is a faith. It is a dogmatic assertion that certain changes occur, and an almost religious-like clinging to that notion in spite of all logic, contradictory evidence, or rational thought. And I'm going to prove that in the next couple of hours. It would take a whole series of miracles for evolution to occur. I'd like to discuss 7 of those miracles. Number 13. The first assumption is that non-living materials somehow gave rise to living organisms. Such a process has never been observed and is impossible to reproduce. Such an event would require a miracle and must be accepted on faith. Number 14. The second assumption is that this type of spontaneous generation has occurred only once in Earth history and that it has not occurred again. This is an act of faith and would require a miracle of enormous magnitude. Number 15, the third assumption is that viruses, bacteria, plants, and animals are all interrelated. There are no transitional forms between these major groups of organisms in the fossil record, and there is no scientific evidence for such a process, but the evolutionists believe it anyway. That takes a real act of faith. Number 16, the fourth assumption is that single-celled organisms gave rise to multi-celled organisms. No one has ever seen this happen. There are no scientific reasons for this to occur. It takes a real miracle for this to happen. But that's what the evolutionists believe. Number 17, the evolutionists believe that all of the various invertebrates, such as jellyfish, sponges, worms, and mollusks, are all interrelated. Once again, this belief cannot be scientifically tested, so their belief is based on a belief in a miracle. Number 18, the evolutionists believe that the invertebrates gave rise to vertebrates, such as fishes, reptiles, mammals, and man. Once again, there is no scientific evidence to show that this ever did happen at all, nor that it ever could happen. So the evolutionists are taking it on faith, and it would take a miracle for it, meaning evolution, to have happened. Number 19, and the last assumption the evolutionists make is that various forms of life gave rise to other forms of life. The fish gave rise to the frog gave rise to the snake, and the snake gave rise to the bird and to the mammals. Since there is no evidence for these developments in the scientific data, we must again assume many miracles to account for them. Before we examine these two theories a little more in detail, I'd like to discuss some real strange conclusions that the evolutionists have come up with. Charles Darwin was the father of evolution, but he had some strange thoughts about the evolution of the giraffe. Darwin was apparently intrigued by the long neck of this animal and tried to explain it in evolutionary terms. His conclusion was that the giraffe's food supply started disappearing on the lower branches of the trees that they munched the leaves off of. So the giraffe, who was able to reach his neck, to stretch his neck, to reach the leaves on the top, survived. That makes sense, doesn't it? Those with shorter necks could not reach their food supply, so they were not able to survive. That's the way Darwin reasoned. That seems to be a reasonable explanation based on actual observation of the facts. The giraffe has a long neck, and it survived because it had adapted to its changing environment. Perfectly logical, according to the evolutionists. But let's go back to our picture of the giraffe. You'll notice that the picture has both an adult giraffe and a young one. If the evolutionists are right, if Darwin was right, the young giraffes who don't have a long neck could not reach their food supply, so they all died, and one generation later, the giraffe became extinct. If young giraffes don't have a neck long enough to reach their food, they starve to death. And if all young giraffes die, the giraffe becomes extinct. Nice try, Darwin, but your theory is not very logical. Let me give you another animal that gave the evolutionists real fits they can't explain. This is the platypus, and it was first seen in 1797. It's a drawing of one, but it was a real enigma to the evolutionists. It had a tail like a beaver, a bill like a duck, it laid eggs, and it fed milk to its young. It looked like a combination of reptile, bird, fish, and furred animal. When scientists first discovered this little animal, they sent it back to England for examination. One zoologist believed it was a freak imposter sold to gullible seamen by Chinese taxidermists. This is science now, please understand. There was another one who was so convinced it was a fraud, he tried to pry the duck bill off with scissors. In fact, the marks of the scissors can still be seen today on the original platypus skin in the British Museum of Natural History in London. There is absolutely no evidence it could have evolved from anything. Nice try, evolutionists, but you can't explain the platypus. Dr. Paul Ehrlich, in this book, entitled The Population Bomb, and there it is, little paperback, also made some puzzling statements about early man. He wrote this on page 31, number 20. Sex in man also evolved to ensure their successful reasoning. Now, I'm sorry, I know this is science, and I shouldn't laugh. I'll try to keep this on strictly scientific basis. I'll be as sober as I can. Notice how brilliant Dr. Ehrlich was. Early man didn't have sex to reproduce his race. That's what Dr. Ehrlich just said. He had to have some other means to create new life. Yet there is absolutely no evidence that that statement is true. Early man had to have sex or he couldn't produce offspring. Without children, man would have become extinct. So early man didn't produce any offspring. And without any children, modern man couldn't evolve from early man. So man became extinct according to Dr. Ehrlich. The good doctor offered us another brilliant statement on page 34 of his book. He wrote number 21. Billions of years of evolution have given us all a powerful will to live. Apparently the doctor believes that early forms of life did not have a powerful will to live because that evolved in later forms of life. If early forms of life did not have a powerful will to live, they didn't survive. Early forms of life had to have a powerful will to live, just like current forms of life. It couldn't have evolved. Nice try, Dr. Ehrlich. When I was a child, my mother read me fairy tales, stories about frogs turning into princes. My mother was very careful to explain that these were just make-believe, that frogs cannot turn into princes. And that story that she had just read me was a fairy tale. I wasn't to believe it. Little did I know that when I got to college, I would find out that my mother was wrong. Frogs do turn into princes. The process is called evolution. H.G. Wells wrote, number 22, no rational mind can question the invincible nature of the evolutionary case. In other words, you're not rational if you don't accept evolution. Let's look at the theory of evolution rationally to see if it is invincible. I'm going to discuss 9 scientific evidences and facts that prove evolution is not only not invincible, but it is false. Evolution could not have occurred. The evolutionists assume that life arose by chance. Apparently they reason thusly. Number 23. Life exists. There is no creator. There is no known mechanism that can create life. Therefore, the only possible way it could start is by chance. This is what we are being asked to believe by the evolutionists. Number 24. By chance, nothingness developed into substance. Substance evolved into a very highly complex organization, all without a designer. Notice that they are saying that there was no first cause. They're telling us we don't believe in God or a creator or a designer. Therefore, there is no first cause. Life just started, and we don't know what started it. Let's examine the chances of chance being the first cause of life. It is known that protein is the building block of life, and protein is made up of chains of amino acids. A very simple protein would consist of a chain of about 100 amino acids. These amino acids must be in a very precise order, and any order other than the one that gives life would not allow the protein to constitute life. Just how many ways can just 100 amino acids line up to make one simple protein? We can turn to the laws of mathematics to answer that question. But to understand what I'm about to discuss, I'd like to explain the laws of probability as simply as I can. One chance in 100 is written 1 with 10 to the second power. The last number, the 2 in this case, tells you how many zeros come after the number 1. So, one chance in 1,000 would be written 1 over 10 to the third power, or 1 to 1,000. Now, there are about 10 to the 158th power ways that 100 numbers can be arranged by chance. If you drop cubes out of a box, each one numbered with the number between 1 and 100, there would be 1 through 100, there would be rather 100,000, or a number 1 followed by 158 zeros. There would be that many different ways that those cubes could align. Not 100, not 1,000, 1 followed by 158 zeros. That number is larger. The number that I just gave you is larger than number 25. The number of living things in the earth, 10 to the 29th power. The number of atoms in all living things on earth, 10 to the 41st power. The number of atomic nuclei in the sun, 10 to the 57th power. The number of stars in the cosmos, 10 to the 22nd power. Number of seconds in the 5 billion years of the universe, 10 to the 17th power. And the number of grains of sand on all beaches of the earth, 10 to the 20th power. In other words, the chances of only 100 amino acids lining up in precisely the right order to produce life produces a larger number than the number of atoms in the entire earth. What are the chances of anything happening by chance? Scientists have attempted to measure that probability, and that figure is extremely interesting. Astrophysicists estimate that there are no more than 10 to the 80th infinitesimal particles in the universe. The age of the universe in its present form is estimated to be 30 billion years, or 10 to the 18th power seconds. Assuming each particle can participate in 1,000 billion different events every second, and that's impossibly high, of course, then the greatest number of events that could ever happen, or trials that could ever be made in all the universe throughout its entire history, is only 10 to the 80th power times 10 to the 18th power times 10 to the 12th power, or 10 to the 110th power. By the way, most authorities would make this figure much lower, about 10 to the 50th power. Now, what does all of this mean? It means that any event with a probability of less than one chance in 10 to the 110th power cannot occur. Its probability becomes 0, at least in our known universe. Therefore, the chances of a protein consisting of only 100 amino acids could never, never, never happen by chance. Therefore, protein could not happen by chance. Another scientist has determined that even the simplest protein molecule that could be imagined has a probability of 1 in 10 to the 450th power. Another scientist has calculated that the probability of a typical DNA chain to be 1 in 10 to the 600th power. That means that DNA, the ingredient of all life, could not have come into existence by chance. What are the chances of chance accounting for the beginning of life? The gentleman on the right is Sir Frederick Hoyle, one of England's most prominent scientists. The gentleman on the left is Professor Chandra Wickramasinghe, the professor of applied mathematics at University College at Cardiff. Professor Hoyle was knighted in 1972 and awarded the Royal Medal in 1974 by the Queen of England in recognition of his contributions to theoretical physics and cosmology. In 1981, these two gentlemen got together to compare their research on the origin of life. Each had done independent research into the mathematical chances of life starting by chance. Each has found that the odds against the spark of life igniting accidentally on Earth were staggering. 1 chance in 10 to the power of 40,000. By the way, 1 chance in 10 to the 40,000th power is comparable to the chances of rolling double sixes or 12 on dice 50,000 times in a row. Please remember that any event with a probability of less than 1 chance in 10 to the 110th power cannot happen. And each of these two eminent scientists concluded that the chances of life originating by chance are 1 in 10 to the power of 40,000. Professor Wickramasinghe is quoted as saying, number 26, "I am 100% certain that life could not have started spontaneously on Earth. The probability of life originating at random is so utterly minuscule as to make it absurd. It becomes sensible to think that the favorable properties of physics on which life depends are in every respect deliberate." Their discovery that the universe had to be created by a creator was reported in this article in the August the 14th, 1981 Daily Express newspaper in London.